G'day and welcome to another episode of Down to Business. Great guest today with Mark Fitzgibbon, the CEO of NIB. Very well known, not only in Newcastle but around Australia for that matter, in what he does. And I'm glad to have him along today. A lot bigger business than probably some of our viewers, but from my perspective, it's just scalable, and I think we can learn a lot from someone that's been in this role for a long time. But without further ado, welcome, Mark, and thanks for coming along.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation.
No, pleasure, mate. And rather me
Good
do
to be
too
back
much
here
of
at Enigma and their wonderful surrounds.
Yeah, nice office. Rather than me do too much of an intro, I'd love to hear a bit more from your perspective. You've been in the role for quite a while, and I've got some questions on that. But maybe a bit of background on how you ended up to where you are, not only today, but in the current role at NIB.
Well, it's a bit of a long story. What have we got, an hour or two?
We've got time.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the country. I grew up in Cessnock, so I was a local by birth and spent a lot of time hanging out in Newcastle and playing football, going to the beach, etc. I left school. I always had ambitions to be, the boss of something.
Yeah.
I was always full of ambition. It's a bit of a Fitzgibbon trait, I suppose. Started uni at Newcastle, worked for a plumbing firm for a bit, but then got offered a job at the largest corporation in town, which happened to be Cessnock Council back then, and accidentally I started a career in local government.
Yeah.
So I spent 17 years in local councils. I think I worked for 7 councils in that period, graduating up the ranks. To the point where I ran I ran Maitland Council for a couple of years. When I think back, I was a bit mercenary, to be honest. Balcombe Hills Council and Bankstown Council, which was one of the state's largest council. And I drove a few reforms in local government. I've always been dissatisfied with the status quo, which I think is an important trait of any leader. And so after 17 years in local government and having done my thing, I sort of new opportunities. Local government's not an easy industry to springboard from into the corporate world. And segue for me was a job running the industry association for licensed clubs throughout New South Wales and Australia. That was a wonderful time. It was an industry that was in trouble on the back of hotels being awarded poker machines, which they thought was the end of the world. The club industry, that is, but you can't just lay down and moan and groan and bleed to death. They had to revitalise themselves, and I think the clubs have done a pretty good job since then in doing that. One of the important reforms I led with the help of others was the ability of clubs to trade their poker machine in entitlements, which at the very least gave some clubs an opportunity to consolidate and maybe last another 10 or 20 years for the diggers who had formed them back post World War II. So I spent, I think, almost 4 years at club, and then the headhunter who put me into clubs presented this opportunity at NIB, and that was 18 years ago now, and I've been pretty much there, well, not pretty much, I've been there ever since. Mind you, the NIB we have today is a different beast to the one that I commenced employment with back in 2002. It's a wonderful company. I'm not responsible for NIB. It had been in existence 60 years prior to my arrival, and my predecessors, Carl Rogers and others, had done a wonderful job in creating the company they had. NIB is actually an amalgamation of a number of smaller health insurers back throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, but it was very much NIB back then. It had somewhat of a national presence. There was a large membership, for example, in the Illawarra. It had merged with a Wollongong-based fund back in the 70s, I think it was. But we saw an opportunity to do something much more ambitious with us, and I like to claim today that we now run a top ASX 100 company. We're generally a national business. We're the second largest health insurer in New Zealand, for example. Our footprint is Australia-wide. We have a joint venture in China. We have an international students and workers business, which with people in China and India in particular. And we have a global travel business. We've come a long way since 2002. on the back of many efforts and the people in the business, because you know yourself as a leader, your number one job is to get the right people on the bus. To quote Jim Collins, because ultimately we only orchestrate the business. We're like the maestro in an orchestra. We rely upon tremendously talented people to make the music.
Yeah, I think it's a great, and I'll come back to some of those side ventures in a minute, but I think it's a great thing you say about that exact point, and a couple of people in these videos have mentioned the same thing, where what is a leader's role? And it's probably to make others or develop leaders around them to make that life easier. But coming back to you as the leader, but 18 years, as you said, that's in a world or a modern day corporate world where that kind of longevity is probably not common. What's some of the things you've had to learn on the way, or some of the tips and that may be the case, to not only be, staying in that role as CEO, but to continually stay on top of your game to make sure that, no one's trying to push you out?
Oh, I think it's a whole welter of things. You certainly, 18 years is very unusual for a CEO to be running a publicly listed company in particular. You see it all the time with private companies. But it is unusual in ASX companies. So I suppose one of my priorities from here, definitely one of my priorities from here is to ensure that I leave a good legacy for whoever follows. So my succession planning is is an important priority for me and the company. I'm not racing out the door. In fact, I've never been more excited about the business than I am today, given some of the opportunities we have. But I need to be. I need to accept the reality, so I'm probably not going to be there for 30, or certainly not 40 years. That's an issue. But look, just the same traits that I tried to apply, when I started at NIB and in my other roles. First of all, you need to be able to form a vision about how things may be different or better, or how the world may be different. And how you need to adapt to that world and new circumstances. So I suppose the intellectual discipline and the curiosity to think about the future and where your business fits into that future is important. Being able to make that real for people is an important leadership trait. We apply the test at work. How would you explain this to your friends at the pub or your mother over Sunday night dinner? Like, if you can't make it real for people, maybe it is a little bit altruistic. So that ability to articulate a view about the business strategy, the future and the business strategy is important. We certainly encourage and give people a license to think differently and innovate. We have this guiding philosophy in the business we call Red Queen Racing, which sounds a bit cheesy. It probably is to most, but underneath it is a serious intellectual discipline about how we think about the economy and marketplaces and our ability to adapt in those marketplaces. So having some sort of mode of operation, some sort of operating philosophy is important. And as I think I started off by saying, what keeps me going is, and I suppose why I've survived so long, is I've never rested on my laurels, so to speak. I've never been satisfied that what we've done is good enough, that we can hang up our cue now. And that hunger still exists in the business. And in fact, we're doing some things in the business today which I think are more innovative and adventurous than anything we've done before.
Yeah, right. And I guess that probably leads into the next point around your personal motivation. You say about not rest on your laurels, and not only is that good for keeping you in that position, but it's also good for your own motivation, I guess. But from any other business owner sort of watching, what's some of the rituals or habits or things you do to make sure you stay productive and stay motivated and stay in the game, personally?
Yeah, well, again, a whole range of things. I'm curious. I like to think that I'm always at the cutting edge or zeitgeist of what's ever happening in industry. Like, I have a hunger for research and learning of what is happening in the marketplace and in other parts of the marketplace in other sectors. So, in this case, healthcare, having a good understanding of what's happening in healthcare and how it's evolving and changing, and COVID-19 has is certainly created all sorts of new thoughts in that respect. So being curious and taking what's a better word than an intellectual approach, but you get my drift. Reading and being hungry for
that constant learning.
That constant learning. So that's a part of me. I wouldn't say I work any harder than anybody else. I'm always on kind of thing. But that's okay. I can be at the beach still thinking about work on Sunday and be perfectly contented in the moment with that. So, you have to. I suppose you have to some extent, live your business and make sure that that doesn't compromise your family and personal life. I think physical fitness is important. I suppose we read and hear about this all the time, but I really believe there's a powerful connection between our physiological health and our mental health well-being. So that's important to me. And I suppose, again, and everyone aspires to this and would like to claim it, but I think I've got a fairly reasonable life balance. I still get my fun with the lads and my time with my family. I love my footy, as you well know. So, there's a whole range of things I suppose that go into keeping us reasonably well balanced. Recognising that most CEOs have an element of madness about them. But they're probably the ones that best define me.
Yeah, good. Okay. Again, now most business owners wouldn't have as many people under their, let's say, control, for a better word, than yourself. But in your position, and even still with lesser people, probably struggle to stay in touch with everyone. How do you manage to maybe not stay in touch with everyone, but stay effective around everyone and keep those relationships up?
Well, it's been made all the more interesting by COVID-19, hasn't it? But somewhat paradoxically, I think COVID-19 might help us in that respect. This idea that we're more engaged with our people and give them greater sense of clarity of direction and coaching and feedback by coming to work each day 9 to 5. I think COVID-19 is challenging that, and I think as we were discussing earlier, we've adopted a position that there's no going back to what was normal. Our policy from here on is pretty in this distributed workplace. We don't call it working from home because it isn't necessarily at home. Some people may have other locations where they choose to work. We don't call it remote working because that still suggests that there's a mothership and anywhere else is remote, it's distributed working. So, our policy at NIB forthwith is that people get to choose wherever they'd like to work. And whatever suits them best. For most, that will be home, provided that we can meet the technological requirements of the position. Obviously, if you're in a contact centre servicing members, you need the technology needed to support that. But that doesn't seem to be a barrier in the vast majority of cases. And provided that you're safe and well.
Yeah. Because
we recognise the psychosocial risks which can come with people being isolated or not being able to deal with their circumstances at home. So that's our starting point. We still have we still require people to come to work for specific reasons. So coming to the office 9 to 5 each day is no longer the default position. Home or wherever you choose to work is your default position, but you're required to come to work for things like induction, training, team meetings, agile scrum meetings. Bonding sessions, socialisation, client meetings, etc. So we are still providing some office space, what we call hubs or base stations, for those specific purposes, and for those people who just don't have any alternative but to come to some office location because of their. So, but the point of that story, I guess, is that people, when they think about this new world, they think about the physical, the location aspects. But what this suddenly does is require us to think differently about how we actually go about work. It requires us to think even more deeply about the psychological and social needs of our people. Maybe coming to the office, for all those years 9 to 5, didn't make Jane feel any less socially isolated. Maybe we can create new opportunities for Jane or Tom to be more socially engaged with their colleagues or or clients or whatever. And it's going to make us become much more focused upon setting, being very clear for our people about what's expected of them, their goals and roles, coaching them, measuring performance and outputs. Because what's become very clear to me, and I'm sure to others through COVID-19, for some people, their output was they came to work each day.
Yeah.
They could be seen. And now we don't want that line of sight philosophy to be the approach we use to producing results for our businesses. We want to be able to better set and measure outcomes. So I think it's COVID-19 and this aftermath is creating a new cadence of working and approach to work. So getting back that was a long answer to your question.
No,
I think in a somewhat paradoxical way, if we do it right, the new world that we imagine post-COVID-19 will actually improve the level of engagement because we'll be more focused upon the risk of not having engagement. And I think as time goes by, where some people are missing those relationships at work, we need to deliberately think of ways to substitute for that disconnection with their colleagues. I think it's helped people build relationships at home and with friends. People appear to be spending more time with their families and people in their neighbourhoods, etc.
So with that, and that's some, I agree. We've seen some real innovation from a people perspective during COVID-19 in particular. But I guess even from a flexibility point of view, everyone touts it, but really, what does it mean? And we've had to actually live it in recent times. So it's a great one. But some of your ideas and thoughts are, and as you said, pushing where the world will be or could be or whatever it may be. And this is probably a pointed question around stakeholders. How do you bring all stakeholders along with you, especially if they aren't as forward thinking or don't see that kind of way? Because you'd have a lot of different definitions to what a stakeholder is.
Yeah, well, look, for those who are interested, I've had a lot of influences on my thinking over the years. And look, there's a lot of management literature out there, a lot of which is dross. Don't bother, but a lot of it is high quality. I mentioned Jim Collins' Good to Great, which some of your viewers, listeners, would have read. A fantastic bit of management literature. How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think Dale Carnegie wrote that in 1935 or something. Read it again today; it's still meaningful. It's still
one of the books we have on our list for our development. Yeah.
People listen to you when you listen to them. For example. So, another great very small piece of literature I'd highly recommend. And John Cotter's seminal Why Transformational Efforts Fail is a must read for anybody, which is getting back to your question. And so Cotter has a number of key principles around why transformational efforts fail, and so therefore they're guiding lights as to how to make run your company or business. And we've touched upon some of these already, having a guiding and meaningful vision about where you see the company being in 5 and 10 years is important. People, if they're going on a long march, they like to know where they're getting to at the end. Getting people, to understand how they have a role to play in the business and that transformation. For most of our evolution, as workers, we got to see the end product. Like if you're working in a cobbler's shop in 1850 and just cutting the leather, sure, all you did all day was cut the leather, but you got to see the end product, the shoe. And psychologists call that closure. It's important. So important psychological need we have to see how we're contributing towards an output. So getting people to understand their role in the business and the transformation. Constant communication. Cotter says, work out how much time as a leader you need to spend on communication, and then multiply by 10. It still won't be enough. As leaders, we often make the mistake that we're looking. I explain this to everybody, I don't need to explain anymore, but and I must drive some people batty, but some of the concepts we're unfolding in our business, I just speak about so often with investors and staff. And I think, God, people have got to be sick of hearing this, and some will be sick of hearing it, but for others, the penny will only be starting to drop. Plenty for small-term wins, and celebrating those wins. If you're going to take a long 5-year march on a business transformation, people get weary, so you have to plan for short-term wins and celebrate those wins, so people feel as though they are making a progress. And look, you have to remove obstacles. Inevitably, in any business, particularly if you're really trying to transform the business, there are going to be blockers. And for those who may have read and studied a little bit of Machiavelli, we know that people will defend the status quo with vigour. And those who stand to benefit by the change, they'll be quiet because they're worried about sticking their heads up. So as a leader, you need to make clear the path for those people who are going to make the transformation, and sometimes remove the people who, no matter how hard you might try to win their support, for all sorts of reasons, you just aren't going to support the kind of change. And look, and their opposition may not be overt. It may just be friction and inertia and a lack of passion. So, one of the things, we need to do as leaders is make those hard decisions where we recognise that, there are people who are going to block the progress we'd like to make for all sorts of reasons, philosophical, social, and otherwise, or they may just be square pegs and round holes. So you're trying to change the shape of the company, but where you're taking it is not aligned with their skills and experience.
And I guess then you started to touch on change and challenge the status quo, and you've said that a few times. And we'll talk, I guess, for a better way of innovation and finding new ways. And you mentioned earlier, a lot of the different divisions or businesses that NIB's involved with that many wouldn't know about. What's your approach to innovation? And I know you like it, but practically, how do you roll that out? And where does some of the thought process come from?
It's not going to sound very practical, the way I'll start to describe this, but I'll get to the practical side of it. So, we have this mantra, if you like, called Racing the Red Queen. Now, what is Racing the Red Queen? Now, I suppose many of your listeners will be too young, but in Lewis Carroll's, wonderful Alice in Wonderland, or looking through the Alice through the looking glass window, whatever it was. There's a character called the Red Queen, and the Red Queen is running on the spot at pace, and the March Hare says to her, "Where are you running to?" She said, "No, I have to run as fast as I can just to stay where I am." And this was actually Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, taking a piss out of Charles Darwin, who in 1856 had come back on the Beagle to introduce his concept of evolution, natural selection, survival of the fittest. Now, to some that was heresy. What are you talking about? God created us. The others was just laughable. And Lewis Carroll was, as I say, taking the piss. And so, the Red Queen, Lewis Carroll was saying, the Red Queen needs to run as fast as she can, read mutate, just to stay where she is, means survive. And so, evolutionists and biologists have picked up this characterisation ever since to explain the process of constant mutation and natural selection. Those mutations that work get selected in, and those mutations that don't get selected out. And there's a perspective which says this is thinking about management and marketplaces and economics as more a biological system rather than a physical system of straight lines, linear equations and whatnot. Better describes how markets and economics and businesses work. Because really the only reason the early economists borrowed the paradigm of physics was because that was the only reputable science around at the time. It was the science of Newton and Galileo and others. So they sort of hitched their wagon to physics as a way of describing economies and marketplaces. This takes perspective now. Nobody can predict the future. The best we can do is continually experiment and be very good at amplifying those experiments that work and ruthless at cutting off those that don't, just like things operate in nature. And so we actually apply that perspective at NIB, both within the traditional business of health insurance and a number of the adjacent businesses that were created. And the principles are, a number of things. First of all, we talk about relatedness. So whatever innovation we're making has to be related to our core business. We won't go off and start drilling for oil as an experiment. We have to be able to demonstrate to ourselves and have a strong thesis that, look, we have skills and capabilities which will create revenue and cost synergies by doing this. So, it was an easy decision for us to go to New Zealand, for example. It was an easy decision for us to start insuring international workers and students. We have about 200,000 today. We ensure that before we make any move, that we're well prepared. We've done our homework. And that may sound self-evident, but you'd be surprised the amount of companies that make these investments here, there, and everywhere without having properly done their homework. We call that prepared minds, borrowing Louis Pasteur's famous quote that fortune favours the prepared mind. Mm. And finally, we'll never make a big bet on innovation. Like the deer doesn't grow a fifth leg overnight to escape the faster line. We always make anything innovative, experimental, we'll always make a small bet, prepared to lose that bet if that business doesn't turn out the way we hope. And we've had a few of those. Like we started up a cosmetic travel business based in Thailand for a while. We killed that off. It just didn't work. Yeah. And I won't go through all the failures, but amongst all those failures, we've had quite a number of successes. And as we've made that initial small investment, when I say small, we've invested $100 million in some businesses, but that's relatively a minor bet for us. As those businesses have succeeded, we've amplified that investment, and as I say, cut off those that happen. So that's our approach to innovation. Getting our people to understand that nobody can predict the future in the way of physics, and even physics gets that terribly wrong often. That the best we can do is have an informed view about possible scenarios in the marketplace, and placing small bets on each of those scenarios with the view to being able to leverage those small bets if that's the way the world turns.
And are most of those ideas that come forward to consider and make a bet on, is that encouraged from the teams? Is that encouraged from the existing internal structure, or as they brought to you? Where's most of that come from?
Well, so it's a cultural strategic imperative. Everyone in the business, I'd like to think most could actually, maybe not in the detail like I have, but explain the essence of Red Queen Racing. This license, it's deeply ingrained in our culture and our values. This license to think differently about the world and how we might make experiments designed to better adapt the business to that world. So there's license throughout the company to experiment, and it doesn't have to be enter some new market. It may just be some new approach to processing claims and embracing some new technology. Yep. For example,
you're doing things better.
Yeah. So sometimes that will be identifying opportunities to build our own capability, or to find a partner relevant to that scenario and that opportunity, or to buy an asset. So some of the new businesses we've developed over the years has been a combination of all. We bought an existing business to get into the market for international workers, but we then invested heavily in it. We built our international students business from scratch. We built that independently. In our new Honeysuckle Health data science company, we're doing that with a joint venture with a large US healthcare company called Cigna. So there's a variety of avenues we take to give life to these ideas and innovation.
Yeah, right. And I guess not only from an innovation sense from business, but innovation sense from people. And I follow and watch your your version of blog or your videos, your Fridays with Fitz.
Shout out for Fridays with Fitz.
But I mean, how do those things come in? Like, what's the importance of adapting to new generations and new medium for that matter?
Oh, vitally important. Like, it's unusual not to have my phone somewhere nearby. Look, our window, our members and travellers' windows to the business in the future will be the digital device in whatever form it evolves to being. So, it sounds a little bit corny, but like so many other companies, we do need to become a technological company in our form, to do what we do, and I think that's true. Most companies these days, particularly in healthcare and financial services. So, keeping abreast of developments in technology is touches every part of the business, from the way we design products, and we have a completely different view about the future of our value proposition as a company, and I hope you can come to that through to the way we market. Like half of our investment these days is in social marketing, to the way we engage then with our customers, to the way we guide our members to to doctors and hospitals, to the way we pay claims. So we need to be at the vanguard of technology, and the fact that we're in healthcare with the emergence of so much health tech makes it all the more important.
Beautiful. I guess that probably a good segue to the next one, interaction, and you mentioned about your members and other stakeholders. I know you pop up everywhere in a community sense from an NIB point of view, yourself personally for that matter as well, but what is the importance of interaction with your community, whether that be Newcastle or wider, and what's your philosophy around that as well, from what's the right amount to get into, or what sort of areas to get into, etc.
Yeah, well, our communities are widespread now. I had an email just last week from a member, and look, I'm sure her voice is that of many people who feel it's wrong that we have employees in the Philippines, for example, serving members. But those people too have families and work in communities, and we support them. So we have people in Ireland, we have people in San Francisco, New Zealand, as I've mentioned, Tianjin and Shanghai. So our community footprint's quite large. We're not BHP Billiton. I don't want to give people the wrong impression, but we do have a broad. So across those communities, we're engaged in many levels in supporting our ESG obligations, which environmental, social, governance. Probably from we have 5 key principles around that. We're pursuing. Obviously a strong environmental perspective on reducing our carbon footprint. We see our role for ourselves in economic development, which is for us largely around employment, but not just in Newcastle and Sydney, but also in other places where if we can grow our business, we'll employ people and help the local economies. We see a role for us in leading governance and transitional and the evolution of our thinking. I think the COVID-19 response is an example of where we're trying to take a leadership position, because we think it would be better for the society and the community. Look, we may be wrong on that front, only time will tell, but at least we're having a crack. And but easily the most significant opportunity we have to improve the lot of the community and the society in which we live, and part of that's through engagement, is in population health. The reality of it is we can't make the difference to global warming that an airline can, or steel producers can, because our carbon footprint's not that large, but we can make an impact in respect of population health. And it's not as though we don't need to. There's a lot of inequity and in health outcomes for communities. Some of the regional communities have very poor health outcomes and health status relative to us in metropolitan areas, particularly Indigenous communities. In New Zealand, we're working hard with a number of Maori iwi or Maori tribes to improve their health outcomes. Again, typically health outcomes aren't good relative to the population at large. So our engagement in terms of our ESG responsibility, our sustainability, our obligations to the community is mainly focused around health. And then if you go down that road, there's a whole swag of things going on from our NIB Foundation, which has contributed about $10 million to various healthcare initiatives throughout the community, to our new joint venture, Honeysuckle Health. And in the other part of the community, we see as another element of that is the role we can play in creating a sense of community spirit and cohesion. And as strange as it may sound, we see investments like our investment in the Newcastle Knights, the Richmond Tigers, the Auckland Blues, obviously they're there to drive brand awareness and marketing, absolutely for sure. But there's also an element of us, wanting to, get behind communities, and in that case, sporting communities, and build that sense of community identity and association.
Yeah, well, I mean, in particular, no better way of proving that in Newcastle, with which I think is as much the ownership's what it is. It's a great sense of club and community in that club. I've never been anywhere else in a town, I guess, where when a club's winning, the town feels upbeat. So I get what you're saying.
And even things, part of the attraction of our major sponsorship with the Richmond Tigers. It's not just because they keep winning competitions, because when we jumped on board, I think they ran 10th. Yeah. But their Indigenous programs and their commitment to reconciliation, and so they are a very suitable partner.
Tick a lot of boxes. Yeah. Few more questions. One, you keep, and I gather, I guess your answer here, but I'd love to hear it. You keep mentioning we, and how important is your team and your direct team to achieve what you do?
Oh, I think I've touched upon it, absolutely. I had 10 direct reports, and we can run out of metaphors. I used the maestro metaphor before, but I could be a coach, or call it what you will. My job is to build that team, get the right people, to with them, articulate a clear vision for the company, to set out clear expectations and goals and measures of performance, and to, as best I can, coach and support them in fulfilling their purpose as leaders in the business. As I often say to people, people ask me about specifics of business. Okay, how would I know? I don't really do anything. My job is to marshal the forces and
but it's just another great example, and then it's constant reinforcement. We're trying to get business owners to understand is that, you generally get into business because you've been good at something, but when you go into business, it's more about that people management and rallying the troops, exactly what you're saying, rather than doing what you've traditionally done. But your vocation. No, totally. That's not to say. That's not to say you. Delegation can never be abrogation, and I think one of the tricks of leadership is, if I have to go deep on something, I will, and I have the industry knowledge and background to be able to do that. So the fact that I stay above the fray, so to speak, and let people get on and running their business. Doesn't prevent me from getting involved if I see I need to be involved, without wanting to demotivate anybody, of course. So, you can't be totally hands-off in the business, and there's often elements of the business I will get involved. Yeah.
And but there's, you know, somebody once said to me, and I think it's true, and I use it all the time now, that the art of delegation is accepting that nobody will ever do it as well as you can, because you can't do it all yourself. And so when you delegate a responsibility to somebody, you've got to accept that. And the other thing is, Andrew, typically I do a better job than you would have in any case, but you've got to cross that psychological hurdle.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point, and I think the other side note to that is that you know, providing they're getting the same objective and within the constraints of what you've got, they don't have to do it the same way.
No, well, that's right. That's right. No, we all bring a lens to any job or work process, and you can't separate the observer from the observation. So yeah, just because it doesn't.
No, it's something I've struggled with.
That painting doesn't look real good to me. Doesn't mean it doesn't look good to 1,000 other people.
Agreed. All right, a bit more about you. What's, if you think about it, whether it be one or two, what's the hardest lesson or lessons you've had that turned out to be quite a blessing?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, again, I suppose it's how you frame these things, isn't it, a little bit? You know, people have setbacks in life and they never let them go, and they keep looking back and thinking, oh, you know, they let it drag them down. I think I've had my share of mishaps, and I've learned from them, but I don't let them drag me down. I'm very much, as best I can, and you know, hopefully we all try and do this, is, you know, stay in the present and, you know, look forward to the future. We're not here. There'll be billions of years we're not here. So yeah, I've got too many sad tales to tell, but you know, I suppose all I would observe now, and I think the research is becoming more and more compelling. And I know we all hear so much about, you know, staying in the moment and whatnot, but it's actually meaningful. You know, we as individuals run a big risk of getting our thoughts so bogged in things we wish had happened when, you know, that bus has left the depot, or worrying about things that may happen, which may never happen. So, you know, as far as, we need to have plans for the future, but we need to be positive in our outlook in the future, wary of the risks that attend that future, but as best we can, you know, enjoy life and what's going on in the business. I'm sure on a day-to-day basis things will pop up and smack us in the mouth. We might fall off motorbikes, who knows, or whatever.
Bit too soon, mate. Yeah,
but for most of us, you know, the world's a beautiful place. Not all, and sadly, and you know, society, we need to come to grips with the burgeoning rise of psychological injury and mental health. But for most of us, as I say, the world's a pretty good place.
Yeah, good answer. Finally, for a lot of our viewers, I'd like to hear your perspective. If you were starting a business tomorrow, you would what?
Well, first I'd ask myself the question: what problem are we trying to solve here in the marketplace? And I think a lot of people lose sight of that, because that's the guts of it. You know, what problem are you trying to solve? And then just the traditional questions which have stood the test of time. Who are the people you're trying to solve it for? You know, what is your marketplace? How are you going to solve it for them? What is the products? How are you going to sell it to them? You know, what is the positioning, the marketing? How are you going to manufacture the good or service? And how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to fund it? So, I think thinking about a business opportunity is not particularly complex, and it doesn't mean you have to come up with a new problem to solve for society. You may buy a business, but if you're going to buy the business, understand, you know, what the business actually does. Because if you think about, you know, I'm selling a product rather than solving a problem, you'll run the risk of missing opportunities around, innovation and the ability to adapt to changing market conditions.
Good, very good. Well, mate, we could talk about this all day, but in the interest of time, I might try and wrap it up. And usually I try and give a bit of a summary of everything we've discussed, but we've discussed quite a lot, so I think I might allude to some of the things, key things that I got out of that. And I love that a leader should be always challenging the status quo. I thought that was a great point. And realistically, watch your legacy and make sure you're planning for your succession. But that's a very good one for business owners too, because some of the stats on that are absolutely deplorable when you think about succession planning. I love the point you said about not only having a vision and where you fit in the world, but understanding what the world might be like and where you may need to fit. I think that's a very, very good and different spin on how people think about those sort of things. And making sure people not only understand their role, but how they contribute to the bigger picture. I guess that's that perspective that we often don't look at as leaders and get stuck in the grind and just do your job. So to me, again, that was great. Celebrate the small wins, love that. You need your teamwork and make sure you've got that delegation. You referred to being a technology company. And I think that's a good point for nearly any business these days with how the world's going. So that was great. And I think my final one, which I thought was absolute gold, you just said about what problem are you solving? I think too many people do just look at what do we do there and what do we do there rather than say what is that? What's our solution? So, mate, well, that was great. But anything to add, I might throw to you.
Oh, no, just thanks for the opportunity. I guess the other thing, just listening to you then came to mind is a great principle too. As certain increases, value declines. And what that means, so finding that sweet spot between having done your research and being confident enough about a business opportunity, knowing that there's still risk and going too far. Like what's an example, as a footy competition unfolds and, the Storm keep winning, their odds come down. So the certainty of them winning reduces the value. So at some point you have to take a bit of risk, calculated risk, which is consistent with the Red Queen Racing philosophy, but just make sure that you've thought it through.
Not putting all your eggs in one
that
basket.
It is related. Yeah, you're not putting all your chips on 14 black, and that you have the appetite to lose that money if things don't turn out the way you do. But we have to take. We cannot create value in our businesses and to some extent in our lives without an element of risk.
Yeah, great point. And I couldn't let you go without asking about the Knights. I mean, you not only got the corporate connection, but obviously Lachlan, your son, is quite involved. So where do we see the Knights in the next year?
It's funny. Yeah, you said, I think you said I was famous at the introduction, didn't you? I used to be famous running NIB, now I'm famous for being Lachlan's dad. That's okay. He's going well, the young fella. Look, I don't know. I think we should improve on last year. I thought we fell away a little bit this year. But it was a funny old season. It was a long, drawn-out season. A lot of those, we had a very young backline. They'll all be a year older and wiser and more competent. So, we've got a few key signings like Tyson for sale. So, I'd be very disappointed if we didn't make the finals again, and we should aspire to a top four. Mind you, having said that, we should always aspire to win the competition. You may not always hit the bullseye, but every year you've got to be aiming. Just like in business.
There's quite a lot of excitement around too. So hopefully we get back to a bit of a normality for a normal season.
Yeah, and injuries often play a role in all of this. There were a few boys, Lachlan included, Kane, Palmer and others, they were all playing busted towards the end of the year. Now I'm sure there were sides in similar circumstances, but luck does play a hand in success. Mind you, the counterpoint to that is you make your own luck, don't you? I don't think anyone could attribute the success of, say, the Storm and the Chooks in recent years to luck.
It's not dissimilar to business, is it? Well, Mark Fitzgibbon, Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that. I'm sure plenty of people got a lot out of it. And till next time, cheers.